And we're live. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden.
This is Hiram McKenna.
And it's Orthodox Apologetics Live, calling all Papal Apologists, day number 3. So, Father, we were actually just discussing something we were discussing on the War Zone. So let's, we were discussing these recent threads on divorce and remarriage. Because as we know, there are a lot of things that Roman Catholic apologists can't answer Orthodox on or won't answer Orthodox on, and one of them is divorce and remarriage. So you were saying, Father, about something about the number of texts or something like that?
What do you mean?
What were you just saying before we started?
Oh, I was saying that there was a number of... Everybody likes to talk about scholarly studies so much, and you have to be a conventional scholar to even talk of this issue. Cough, cough, Eric. But...
you had to call him out.
But nevertheless, there apparently... There's a book called Marriage in the Western Church, or Remarriage, Divorce and Remarriage in the Western Church. And it makes the point that up until the 9th century, it was normative for bishops to grant divorces and to allow remarriages. And even the cases in which they point out Pope St. Innocent, supposedly in different rescripts. And a rescript is kind of someone writes to you and then they ask you for a reply, and the reply is not necessarily binding, but it's kind of authoritative, like kind of a canonical authority. You might go to 4 or 5 canon lawyers, you know what I mean, for reply, in which in one case he allows divorce with a remarriage, and in the other he doesn't. And so the conclusion some have said is either he changed his mind, or basically there are different circumstances that allow it. But it's still the principle, if you know what I mean.
Well, yeah, but that's actually, that's still, if you look at it from the second perspective, that's still the way it's done today. I mean, it's not like once a person is divorced, they get an automatic free shot at remarriage. Yeah,
and the question is, it has to be a legitimate reason. Yeah. You don't just, and for example, the Council of Arles, which was held in 314, in Canon 10 of the Council of Arles, it says, concerning men, or these men, who find their wives in adultery, and who are young Christian men, and who are forbidden to marry, it has been decided that as long as possible, even if their adulterous wife is living, counsel is to be given them not to marry another woman. Now notice, as long as possible. In other words, they're not forbidding divorce with remarriage. They're trying to keep the marriage together, in other words. They're trying to find some way to preserve the marriage. But they say as long as possible. They didn't say it's completely unallowed. All right. Never.
Well, that's a very important point, because when one of the things that I've tried to I'm trying to point out with this, especially I tried to point out to Eric since you mentioned him, is the fact that the Roman Catholic teaching on divorce being the only time that divorce is not allowed in the Roman Catholic Church is when they don't see a possibility of a real sacramental marriage to begin with. And what I mean by that is the Pauline privilege, basically, which is what the Roman Catholics use, means that basically a marriage can be dissolved if the parties were married before they were baptized in the Catholic Church. So based on that argument, they're basically saying, well, there might not have been a real marriage to begin with. So outside of that, every other possibility for divorce, such as adultery, which is mentioned by our Lord, is not counted in Roman Catholicism. It is not a valid grounds for divorce because there is no valid grounds.
Now, the Council of Vannes, which was held in Gaul, modern-day France, in 465, in Canon 2, states, also, those who have abandoned their wives, just as it is said in the Gospel, except for the case of fornication, who have married another without proof of adultery, we likewise forbid from communion, in order that not through our indulgence they invite more permitted sins to the license of error. Now look at all the little exception remarks in that, all right? Except for the case of fornication, who have married another woman without proof, all right? So in other words, if you kind of get divorced and remarry, but you don't have any proof, then you can't do that. So the canon is assuming what? It's assuming that there is a legitimate grounds for divorce and remarriage.
And this is ultimately what it comes down to, is that really marriage is a mystery of the church. And so the point is, it can't just be broken. It has to be, I hate to say this, but it has to be in a very real way profaned. And if it's profaned, then it's penanced. and that's when the possibility of remarriage can occur. The point is, adultery profanes the mystery.
Yes.
And
now canon. Now I should also note, just continue. The Council of Soissons, which was held in AD 744, in Canon 9 says, similarly, we establish that no layman may either have his parent or a nun as his wife. Seems common sense.
Yeah.
Neither may the husband marry another wife neither may the husband marry another while his wife lives, nor may the wife marry another while her husband lives, because the husband ought not to dismiss his wife unless a case of adultery has been discovered. All right. So there's a lot of these because and unless. So they're assuming, in other words, the canons assume you should only really have one marriage. All right. But that doesn't mean there are not provisions for other cases happening, but they don't want that to happen.
Right. The idea is that divorce is a worst case scenario. It's not. It's not a go-to.
It's like saying someone committed theft. All right, and theft is a deadly sin, and you have to go to confession. And if you die without confession under that sin, you're going to go to hell. My point is that because we forgive in confession the sin, does that mean we justify it? Do you see my point?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Anyway, but so that's one example. The Council of Compiègne in AD 757 ruled in Canon 11: if any man has a legal wife and his brother has committed adultery with her, that brother and that woman who committed adultery may never marry one another while living. That man who was her spouse, if he wishes, has the power to marry another. The Council of Verberie.
That's actually something that should be noted also, that's still a part of the Orthodox tradition today, that guilty parties in adultery aren't supposed to remarry.
Yeah, the other one's punished.
Yeah, so...
Canon 5 of the Council of Verberie, which was held around late 750s, early 760s, says in Canon 5, if a wife has conspired in the murder of her husband with another man, and the man, that is the husband, himself kills the other man in self-defense and is able to prove this, that man is able to divorce his wife and, if he wishes, to marry another. So, you know what I think was happening? I think what was happening was that there were, in fact, some bishops, looking at these two Gallic Frankish councils from the 700s, there probably were some bishops who didn't want to grant divorces and remarriages. But what was happening as a result? People were trying to kill their spouses. Or they were trying to do crazy things,
which still happens now.
Exactly. So the concept is that, which is worse? The wife kill her husband, or the husband kill her wife, or you basically grant the divorce. Now, the Synod of Rome in AD 826, which was held under Pope Saint Eugenius II, said, concerning those men who have divorced their married wives and marry another, let no one, except for the cause of fornication, divorce their married wife and then marry another. Otherwise, it is suitable for the transgressor to be married to the former spouse. If, however, a man and wife consent to divorce between themselves for the sake of a monastic life, in no way shall it be so without the joint knowledge of the bishop, so that they may be stationed by him in a single prepared location. For if due to an unwilling wife or husband, let it not be dissolved for the sake of marriage. And then there's another variant of that canon, Canon 36 of the Synod of Rome in 826, which says, let no one divorce his wife except for the cause of fornication. Truly, if a man and wife wish to separate for pursuing a religious life, let them do so with the consent of the bishop here. For if one wishes and another does not wish, let the marriage not be dissolved. But notice the larger variant of the canon says, who have divorced their married wives and married another. All right, so no one can do this except for cause of fornication, which is in fact how the Vulgate translates porneia, in Matthew. In porneia, in fact, St. Augustine, and there was an article I posted on the War Room that talks about how St. Augustine near the end began to doubt his interpretation of the question, which was, that marriage is indissoluble. And he began to wonder about that based upon the translation of fornicatio as being porneia. Because porneia not just means fornication, it can mean shamefulness.
Well, now, one of the things that I think that, really the nail in the coffin and what really started this discussion in the past couple of days was you had put up the penitentiary of Theodore.
Yes.
Now,
some people say it's not. Some people say, well, it was only composed in the late 700s. It's not really. It has genuine canons of Saint Theodore, but it's mixed up with later Frankish canons from the 700s. That's what some people.
It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
And I'm going to explain why. Because when we're talking about this, and this is one of the things that Eric was doing, was we're going back and forth about councils. But in the end, a penitentiary, what is its purpose, Father? Since you're being
penances, giving penances to people who commit certain sins. The father confessor has a look at a penitential. It's not really done a lot that much anymore, but for major sins, and in the medieval and traditional times, they would look in the penitential to determine what would be the proper penances for sins that were committed.
So we're not even talking about councils. We're just talking about this is for like priests and bishops, regular life.
Yeah, that's exactly what will be done 99% of the time.
So the regular, in terms of regular Orthodox Christian life, the sad reality of divorce existed. The Church knew how to deal with it in the West well before the schism.
Okay. Now, the penitential of St. Egbert of York, which again they say has some legitimate one, anyway, it's still what was being written in the 700s, even if some of them were not the canons of St. Egbert. Okay, says in penitential in the entry or canon, you might say canon 122, it says, if a woman separates herself from her husband, despising him, not wishing to return and being reconciled to the man, then after 5 or 7 years, with the consent of the bishop, he himself may marry another wife if he is not able to be continent. And let him repent for 3 years, or even however long he lives, because of the statement of the Lord establishing the criteria for an adulterer. So notice, that's more than simply just adultery in that case. That goes to the wider concept of the Greek concept of porneia, of shamefulness. Yeah. All right. So the woman separates. I'm not going back. I'm not going to live with you. I hate you. She despises him. She dishonors him. She does everything she can. They're saying you're going to have to wait 5 or 7 years because they want to try to fix the marriage. All right. And then at the end of that, if that can't happen, the bishop can consent to another marriage. All right. Because a divorce has been granted. And then you have a 3-year penance. Now, I should note, when I was like when I was a teenager, around 20 or so, not teenager, I knew a very elderly Greek man who was, I guess, born like in 1920. I don't know if he must be 100. He's probably reposed by now. I haven't talked to him in nearly 20 years. But I asked him, back in the, the 20s and the 30s, did Greek bishops, did they grant divorce as a normal thing? And he said it was heard of, but the bishops and the priests did everything they could to not grant a divorce. But if there was some major problem, after several years, they would finally grant it. All right. So my point is that it didn't mean they were against it. The point was they wanted to try to preserve. This is exactly what the discipline of St. Egbert's describing. All right. Try to find some way of preserving the marriage. But if it seems to be impossible to do that, then a divorce is actually granted with remarriage. All right. Another of the Canon 123 of St. Egbert says, if one's wife is led into captivity and he is not able to redeem her, after 7 years, he may marry another. And particularly, if afterwards, that is the first woman, returns from captivity, let him receive her and dismiss his second wife. And similarly, just as we have said, that woman may do if such have befallen her man. All right? Another from St. Egbert says, if the wife of the same man has committed adultery, the husband is able to divorce her and marry another only if she, the adulteress, was the first wife. But if she was the second or the third, he is not able to marry again. So they didn't allow more than 3 marriages. If the wife wishes to engage in a shameful act during the space of 5 years, then she ought to marry another man. If the husband is dead, the wife is able to marry in the space of a year. Now, just let me stop here. Do you know why the canons actually are much more strict about women having to wait a year to be married, where a man could wait like 40 or 50 days? You know why? And the reason is because technically, if a woman's husband dies, she could theoretically still be pregnant with his child. So if she marries 40 days later or something like that, instead of just a year, then maybe they can later cover up whose child was lost. So that's a property issue that canons actually envision, family issue. St. Egbert says, every husband who divorces his wife and marries another in unjust matrimony, let him fast for 7 winters of harsh fasting, or 15 winters lightly. Whoever perpetrates many evil and homicide, the killing of a man, unjust sexual relations with beasts and with women, let him go forth to the monastery and fast always into the end of his life. He truly gives up the money. So divorce is still allowed. Although, again, they kind of wanted to discourage it, but it can be allowed with a remarriage. Because oftentimes people will say, oh, they allow divorce, but what they mean by divorce, they mean just separation, but nothing else.
Yeah.
Now, and the final penitential quote from Egbert is part 26, Canon 26, and it says, well, I'll let people read I'll let people read it. I'm not going to read. We don't necessarily have to go through all of these, but there's a lot of them there. I think if you're on the War Zone, you can read the post. It's not my post. It's whoever runs this blog, Shameless Orthodoxy. But he did a good job compiling these things.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was actually it's a really good job, and the point is that it's really very difficult to say. And I want to address what Atomic Lead wrote. No, I don't think it's an issue of St. Augustine having a bad understanding of Greek or anything of the sort. I think he had a very idealized view of marriage. His own personal life, he himself lived in an unmarried state before he became a Christian and had a child. I think that those things might have colored his position on how correctly marriage should be held, and he had to revise it later. I don't think it was necessarily due to ignorance. I just think that he may have had a higher idealism because of his own life. So I wouldn't.
Yeah, you always have to take the lives of the fathers into context when dealing with controversial issues. For example, if no one took the life of Saint Jerome into context, you wouldn't understand why he says a lot of harsh things he says,
or calls people ignorant and stuff like that.
Yeah, because Saint Jerome, it seems like he was paranoid, but the problem was he had good reason. People were stealing stuff from him all the time. They would steal his books. They would steal his manuscripts. They would lie about him. I mean, it wasn't just crazy old Saint Jerome. And there's that. You have to look at the life of a father about why they said what they said and why they did it. It doesn't mean it's you can just dismiss them, but those issues have to be looked into.
I totally get it. I will say with Saint Jerome anyway. But
Saint Augustine was like one of the only people able to actually successfully deal with Saint Jerome, because Saint Augustine just let everything you just fall
off.
Yeah, he didn't really, because Saint Jerome's initial idea was that people are contacting me only because they want to get in a fight. That's what he thought. And for example, Saint Augustine contacted him one time asking about questions, and Saint Jerome wrote a letter back saying, "Oh, I see. You know that I'm well known, and you want to try to call me out. You're pretending to be my friend, all this other stuff." And Saint Augustine had to write several letters before Saint Jerome would finally tolerate him. But Saint Jerome was a holy man, and we often forget the fathers, when they were surrounded by all these enemies, weren't really sure who to trust, especially in the 4th century where the Arians were taking over a lot of stuff. So, but the divorce and remarriage issue, I think, is it's important that even if people want to say, well, there were some fathers. I mean, for example, some people would argue St. Ambrose did not believe in the dissolubility of marriage. It's possible St. Augustine got his doctrine from St. Ambrose. But technically, other fathers disagreed who were in the West. All right. For example, St. Ambrose believed St. Ambrose believed that a marriage before baptism still counted after baptism. However, technically, that's not the position that was ultimately adopted by the Church. If you look in the apostolic canons, which were made universal by the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and by the way, the papacy and the other Western bishops accepted them, at least the first 50. I think Canon 37 or Canon 27 about ordination and baptism states that any marriage contracted before baptism does not count against somebody if they want to get ordained. So theoretically, someone could have been married 2 or 3 times in the Anglicans or the Roman Catholics or whatever, but if they're baptized, that's the starting point. So you can find various opinions of the fathers that ultimately were never accepted by the Church. Now there's something called the Council of Agde, which is held in 506 AD, and it was presided over by Saint Caesarius of Arles, who was the father of the Church. And Canon 25 says, "But these laymen, who in their marriage, on account of a grave fault, or even if they have already divorced, and proffer no probable cause of discord for the sake of ending their marriage, so that they might presume to enter into either an illicit marriage or another marriage, let them be excluded from the communion of the Church, the holy company of the people, because they defile the faith of marriage, but only if they have divorced their former wives before they have given their cause of discord in a tribunal with the provincial bishops." All right. So notice there's "but only if." All right. So there's oftentimes Roman Catholics will read the first parts of these things, but the other part about, there's the exception clause, that's kind of ignored. So there's just a lot of this information that's I think rather important. Anyway, what do you have to say, Father?
No, I mean I would agree with that. I mean I was actually I was looking at another question
Hmm.
that we got from Dustin Lacko. He had asked earlier, and I know that this is something that I talked about with you. So you wanted to touch on this, and I think it's So I'm going to start with the question, start with what I'm going to say, and I think you'll understand where I'm going with this. Dustin wrote, you mentioned in one of your shows that Luther wouldn't have found most of the RC abuses he was addressing within the Orthodox Church of his time. Would you be able to elaborate upon that or mention specific issues? The letter I was actually referring to was an open letter to the Christian nobility by Martin Luther, and this was, concerning the reform of the German estate. This was in 1520, so this was before the Reformation proper. But what Luther had noticed, in many ways, we can sympathize because we understand the Western Christian fast, the Western Orthodox fast, which isn't very different in terms of it, your typical Eastern Orthodox fast, except maybe the allowance of fish. But the point is that again. Germany's a dairy producing country, and most of the early countries of the Reformation that protested were heavy dairy countries. So whenever a fast came up, it was a bit onerous because they didn't have as many accesses to oils as like olive oil, so on and so forth. That you would find in the southern European states, but more importantly, because of the Russian tradition also is very, very doesn't use much fish or shellfish or anything like that, and it's very low on oil. Almost everything's boiled. So to some degree, that would have been the norm in Luther's Germany. But the point that I'm trying to make here is Luther was upset because of things called butter letters. And what these letters were effectively, they were dispensations for dairy that you could get if you paid enough. Now, keep in mind, one of his complaints was that if a person is sick or infirm, a priest should be able to grant them. Well, in Orthodoxy, we do that. You're dispensed from certain fasts if you can't do them. But this was not happening in Roman Catholic Germany at the time. You had to pay your way out, and so the people who were, the people with the most money were effectively, and this isn't even going into indulgences. It's not even going into the dedications of chapels. I mean, there was a fee attached to everything, and so some of the things that Luther's talking about, including how bishops were made, he points to the Council of Nicaea. Were not in conformity with the way the church does things. And so it would have been, hold on, it would have been something that we would have understood. So, what's it called? That was before Luther's Reformation. Now, Father Enoch noted that he begins to change a little after this period.
Yeah, by 1527, you have what's called the Smalcald Articles. And that's kind of really the point, I think, where he rejects the Mass as a propitiatory sacrifice. He backs away from veneration of the saints. I think that's kind of the point where his theology had kind of led to a major change.
Okay, so, and that major change meant that, in that sense, the early Luther, whom we would have been much more sympathetic, was a lot different than the one that begins tossing out books of the Bible, so on and so forth.
Yes.
And so, and gets married to a nun, all that stuff. Although I wonder how much that was really his fault, because that kind of was a weird situation where
I think she was a canonist or something like that.
She was part of a caravan of nuns that literally got dumped off in the city after they decided to read Luther's papers and decided to leave. And this is kind of like, unfortunately, this is kind of like where, I guess, families would send their second daughter, so on and so forth, and eventually it became sort of like, well, this one will get married, this one will become a nun, so on, and it was kind of decided for them, and so it became an impetus for a lot of them to kind of take off.
Okay. Well, what were the other abuses he was enumerating?
Oh, well, he goes through a number of them. Basically, let's see. Some of them are kind of ridiculous. He goes talking about the degrees of marriage, Goes through the butter letters, the mass letters.
Now, one of the problems with the butter letters is that if a town in Germany built a church tower,
Right.
they could get the dispensation so they could eat dairy during any fasting season.
Exactly.
So basically, what happened if people said, "Well, we don't have enough money to pay our way," the whole town could chip in and build a bell tower, and then that village or town would be perpetually dispensed from, having to do the full fast and such. So now notice that this is a system the papacy developed in order that, but it's far worse than everything about the proprietary church issues and during the investiture conflict. All right. I mean, I saw Atomic Lead ask the question about to what extent did the feudal system have anything to do with the rise of the RC practice, absolute marriage, indissolubility, and clerical celibacy? I'm not too sure, because when you look at the whole 11th century controversy, it was generally the feudal lords and a lot of the local bishops who were, in fact, wanting to preserve the concept of married priests. All right. And because it was it was almost like a more decentralized system. I think he may be saying that there was this whole issue that everybody brings up, again, the proprietary church, who owned the church building. If a nobleman built a church for a village and he gave it gratis to the group of priests who were to administer it, that was considered simony, and then every sacrament was considered simoniac. And then the more extreme Hildebrandians would say everything was invalid that was done there. All right. Now today, I don't think even the Roman Catholics would say if a millionaire built him a church and gave it to him for free that's simony. I mean, for example, they were saying the Hildebrandians were saying it's simony if the nobleman paid the priests a salary for upkeep of the church. All right.
What it really comes down to is that
I think the Hildebrandians wanted the money themselves.
They wanted the money themselves, and more importantly, they wanted to upend the system that already existed. It did not allow for the centralization of power that Hildebrand wanted. And on top of that, the type of company that Hildebrand kept, as Ulrich of Imola noted, these immoral priests, they didn't want to deal with married priests, condemning them or so on and so forth, because they were introducing, I hate to say it, a sodomite class into the clergy.
Yeah, I mean, if you have, it's not a great choice, but if you have the choice between the the very rude country warrior bishop, or supposedly accused of being a warrior bishop who had married, or the kind of mamby-pamby Hildebrandian bishop who had his old boy priests around him. I'd rather be in the diocese of the kind of a country bumpkin bishop.
Yeah,
obviously, and because they didn't tolerate a lot of the stuff. They didn't tolerate that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
Okay.
Now, let me see here. There was another question here. Hold on. It was, what if someone gets divorced and tries to remarry? First off, they'd have to have a legitimate reason for a divorce, such as adultery. If they don't, the church wouldn't allow it. Mm-hmm. So that's
now, if for example, the wife says, "I don't care, I'm just leaving," and then she leaves, and then she gets a civil divorce and she leaves Orthodoxy or whatever, that's a legitimate reason, I would say, because that's abandonment. All right, that's shamefulness. All right, or vice versa for the husband too.
Yeah.
All right. So that's an example. The church would allow a remarriage in those cases. Now in Russia, as I recall, in the 19th century, there was something like maybe no more than 170 divorces granted. All right. And because you had technically to go before like kind of a supreme adjudicator of the Holy Synod or something. I don't know how they arranged it or whatever. And that was one of the issues that was raised at the 1917 Sobor or 1918 Sobor, where they wanted to say, well, bishops should be allowed to have their own tribunals to evaluate divorce cases, because that's how it was before the time of, I think, the Holy Synod with the
Peter the Great,
yeah, because that was technically, back in the 1600s, that's how they would have done it, like in 1600 or 1580 or whatever. The bishop would have had his own tribunal. They would have evaluated the case as to whether they granted divorce or not. But the system became much more centralized under Peter the Great, and to the point where you had to basically kind of go to the equivalent of the ecclesiastical Supreme Court to get a divorce and remarriage. Though I think in the Greek Church, they still allow the bishops individually were still granting divorces in the rare cases that they actually happen. Now, I should make a point. I think we discussed this before, Father Joseph.
Mhm.
If you look at the supposed divorce rate in the, let's say, the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox world, I had to go back to studies about this. They were in fact at the same or lower. They weren't that much different than the supposed annulment rates in the Roman
No.
Catholic world. So in fact, the concept that we had divorce with remarriage did not lead to, the collapse of morality in the Orthodox world. I mean, if you know what I'm trying to say, because that's a common argument that the Roman Catholics make, that if you allow divorce and remarriage, I think if you allow no fault divorce, I think that's a different issue. And the church has never just simply allowed no fault divorce, but you didn't have a mass breakdown of morality in the Serbian, Greek, or Russian Orthodox world because we allow divorces under limited circumstances with remarriage. Okay. What else? What are the other questions we have?
No, mostly people talking about Metzlick. Apparently, he's challenging the Orthodox again, which is I think is funny because I have no problem with going back on the show, but I was planning on doing that after this show.
Okay.
So
we got about 29 minutes left. So
okay. Let's see.
Unless a Roman Catholic apologist pops on and wants to debate us.
We've kind of been waiting.
Then we'll go longer.
Yeah, and we've put the link in the War Room in the Wars Only. There's a lot of Roman Catholic apologists there. Please feel free. If any of you want to jump up and talk about any of these things, divorce and remarriage, or any choice of differences between Roman Catholic theology and the real one, we are here to discuss that. So the point is, I don't think there's. The floor is open. If anyone has questions, please.
So what do you think of the question somebody asked of when did the papist heresy actually arise?
Well, we've covered that a few times, but
because papal apologists will say, well, you can find Pope Nicholas said this, and and that's before Hildebrand.
Right, but the problem with that is that you can't get past the fact that each of these cases, in every single one, they don't have a concept of papal supremacy in the way a Roman Catholic thinks of it. And the reason for that is because most of this stuff, until the Dictatus Papae, was unthinkable. So, the idea that Rome could judge the earth, I doubt even Nicholas had that in his head. And to be quite honest, I think
he must have still had an exalted idea about how.
He could have been a snob. I'm not saying he wasn't. He probably was. But the point is, he might have just felt that Ignatius was, unlawfully removed, and this dude was an usurper, when referring to Saint Photius. But it not, suddenly well, this means that I am going to rule the earth. I don't think that occurred, because the mentality that Roman Catholics tend to think of when they think of the Pope, the whole Pope and nothing but the Pope, comes from the Dictatus Papae. Mm-hmm. So, and that's it's always something to keep in mind, and that's why context is so important. Because if you look at any of these fathers, and even any of these not so great popes, and you read the background to why they're choosing to do something, usually it doesn't match what a Roman Catholic apologist is saying. Like, I would say, not usually, but most, if not all of the time. So I think.
Well, you know how some of the Roman Catholic apologists get around the question of, they say no one can judge the Pope. That's part of their theology. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's the question of the cadaver synod. They tried the body of Pope Formosus. Yep. Right. Well, so you know how they get around that, right? They say it never said one Pope couldn't judge another Pope.
Well, yeah,
that's kind of ridiculous, but.
That's standard to Roman Catholicism, that a pope can revise himself.
So, in other words, he could judge a dead pope, basically.
Yeah, and that's not granted. That doesn't.
They literally did that. So.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, these are uncomfortable truths.
I was reading an interesting article off of academia.edu that talks about there is some of the churches in Rome. Have been severely, parts of their mosaics have been destroyed in parts of the Alps, some of these very ancient churches.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and one of them is the Church of is called Saint Clemente. It's not the famous Saint Clemente. It's kind of another one. They're kind of excavating one, and the reason Well, the conclusion a lot of our historians have is that this was one of the churches that Pope Clement III, or Wibert of Ravenna, had built. And that now remember, when Wibert of Ravenna, or the real Clement III, died in 1100, he died in Castellana Civita or something like that. I can't remember the name of the city. It's like 50 miles outside of Rome. So technically, he still was kind of in control of a lot of Rome. And when the Hildebrandians took back power in Rome, they went on this tour, basically damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory, memoriae. Everything that he had built, any manuscripts, everything was destroyed. All right, which is one of the reasons we have like a lot of paucity of information about things that Clement III actually did and said.
Yeah,
we have, and in fact, that's one of the things I've discovered. You have to deduce a lot from fragments that have been discovered in old libraries. I mean, a lot of times the reason stuff was preserved was because somebody in a monastery or a cathedral assumed, oh, this Clement III must be the Clement III in 1280 or whatever. You know what I mean? So they just didn't care about it. But then later, like in the 19th century, they kind of found some of these things and they kind of published them. But a lot of the material was destroyed. And of course, Wibert was venerated as a saint after he died, as the true pope. And of course, they destroyed they got rid of his body. They didn't. Oh, supposedly they may have actually done a trial or something like that, but I don't know if that actually happened.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, now we're getting questions. So
okay.
Okay. Someone said, Father, can you talk about St. Augustine and the Orthodox Church and the various opinions of him?
Well, the opinion of the Orthodox Church is that St. Augustine is a saint. He is actually called a father of the Church by the Fifth Ecumenical Council. I believe the Sixth Ecumenical Council also names him as a saint.
There's up until really
Saint Photius the Great calls him a saint. He was accepted as. I don't think anybody disputed his sanctity until I don't know. I mean, until what the 20th century.
The 20th century, Romanitas, so on and so forth.
Michael Askell, people like that. I mean, that's really basically the late 1960s.
Yeah, from there on in.
Now, and technically, Romanini's never said he wasn't a saint. He strongly implied that, and I've heard people say, "Oh, he never said that" or whatever. Now, that may be true. I don't know. I knew one priest who actually asked Father Romanides back in the 80s, and Father Romanides actually said, "Well, he made a lot of mistakes, but he is still a saint." Now, I can argue about did he really believe that, or did he say that for political reasons? I don't know. I'll just take him on his word with it. But the point is that a lot of this stuff started only with the so-called almost a pseudo patristic revival. It's not a real patristic revival. Yeah. Back in the 70s, and it came out of the Romanides kind of school in Greece, and it also combined with what was coming out of Holy Trinity Monastery. Not Holy Trinity Monastery, Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston. It's really where a lot of this derives from. The best I can say is he made that it's possible St. Augustine made mistakes. The reason I say it's possible is that I'm still not convinced, like St. Mark of Ephesus, that there has not been some sort of manuscript corruption on some degree of level. Yeah, I know that
you saw some.
You can find some epistles where most of the epistles, even today, will print St. Augustine. For example, the epistle St. Augustine and St. Alypius wrote to Maximus the Doctor, I think. In which, if you read the standard translation of those epistles, it says the Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father and the Son. Well, if you read the oldest manuscripts, they don't say that. They say the Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father. And there used to be a lot of interpolations in most editions of De Trinitate. Now they've gotten rid the edition, the version of De Trinitate you read in the Erdmann's series, which is now printed by Hendrickson, is actually a much more cleaned up version based upon 8th century manuscripts. All right. Because they used to be manuscripts from the 12th century that had the filioque everywhere in the text, all right, and they had whole chapters about unleavened bread and things like that. Obviously the people had just interpolated in the 11th and 12th century. So, anyway, my point is, even if he, so my view of St. Augustine is the same view that we would say of St. Gregory of Nyssa, all right, that assuming these are not corrupted manuscripts. St. Augustine simply erred about points that had not been heavily discussed, and he's just not followed on those points. That's it, and that's the standard. Like St. Irenaeus of Lyon believed in a literal 1,000-year millennium, all right? But the Church no longer accepts that as a valid opinion anymore, All right.
Well,
Since
yeah,
it's
he
the
also
Ecumenical
he
Council.
also believed that our Lord was 50, but even
Exactly.
then we're making fun of him. So
Yeah, I mean, so my point is that you have you got to go with the consensus of the fathers on these issues instead of just pointing out,
not a single father. You have
And
to
secondly, there was, I can't remember, there were several there was a Greek metropolitan of Venice. They had a Greek community in Venice during the 1500s, they had like a metropolitan there. But he was not metropolitan of Venice. He was like metropolitan of some Greek island, but he lived in Venice. Whatever, however they did it. I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book defending St. Augustine and actually going through things in De Trinitate and either pointing out manuscript corruptions or pointing out how this is not meant in the way that the Roman Catholics mean it. And in fact, Patriarch Meletios Pegos, who was Patriarch of Alexandria, I think he died in 1600, wrote a book defending St. Augustine as well. And so a lot of the Greek bishops during the 1500s were in fact familiar with St. Augustine, and they dealt with him, and either they adopted the view that people are misattributing views held to him, or he simply just was mistaken, or these are manuscript corruptions. And that's in fact what St. Germanus of Constantinople said at St. Gregory of Nyssa. That either the manuscripts were corrupted, or he just made a mistake about this issue. And St. Photius explicitly, in I believe the Mystagogy of the Holy Spirit, brings this issue up. He says that one, assuming St. Augustine actually said these things, he is still a saint. He was just mistaken. All right, and people do not like listening to St. Photius when he says that. I don't know why they think, and they oftentimes say St. Photius was too enthralled to the tradition of venerating Augustine. Exactly. And
yeah, we should all be enthralled to the tradition.
Exactly. So if you think you know better than the tradition of how the saints interpreted the fathers and understood who were the fathers, then you have an issue of some subtle form of prelist going on there. And I'm not trying to, I know it sounds like I'm being judgmental, but I mean, it is a serious issue when people act like that.
Okay, Atomic Lead asks, is the RC understanding of the persons of the Trinity as relations of the divine essence to itself a heretical view or merely a novel view to the Orthodox?
Well, I don't think that's acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, it's on its face, it sounds like modalism.
Yes. And
the persons of the Trinity are real persons of the Trinity. It's not the Father talking to himself. So that's not acceptable. Comments Hotel asks, does repenting for your sins to the Catholic Church count? Wow. That's an interesting question.
No. Well, it depends. Who's the Catholic Church? The Orthodox Church is the true Catholic Church.
You
got to repent to your sins of God. It's not necessarily
right. The church is acting as a representative, and that's why I'm wondering. I mean, I'm not saying that obviously Catholic confessions are salvific, but the person's confession by itself, regardless of who he's confessing it to, has to count for something. Regardless, once you received an orthodoxy, that's washed away anyway. But the point is, I'm not going to say, to Roman Catholics stop confessing. What I'm going to say is stop confessing to a papist priest.
Convert to Orthodoxy.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, again, I'm not going to attack something that's good that a papist is doing. I want him to keep doing it, but I want him to do it in the true church.
Yes. Anthony Cavallo says, what is the best way to dip your feet into Orthodoxy? Go to church.
Yeah, I'd go with that.
Go to an Orthodox church.
Well, he also followed up with, what's your opinion of the OCA? I ask this because I will be going to a church service this weekend for the first time. Mm-hmm. What should I expect?
Well, first off, you should know that we're true Orthodox. Our opinion is that you should go to a true Orthodox church. So, we can't really recommend you go to the OCA. That's our view. You may disagree and think we're fanatics. So, but if you're asking me in the abstract what you're going to expect, you're probably going to expect a kind of Russian-style singing, maybe an iconostas. I don't know how the OCA does. The OCA have
most of them have iconostas. Yeah. There may be chairs. There may not be chairs.
Might be pews.
How old the church
you can pretty much go on YouTube and watch services now. I'm not saying to replace it, but if you're like, how's it going to be? You can kind of go on YouTube and watch.
Look up Divine Liturgy. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can start going to different types of places and and see for yourself and such.
Yeah.
But I'd also say you need to start reading the fathers in consort and their commentaries on the scriptures. I mean, don't ever stop reading the scriptures, but reading the early apostolic fathers and St. Chrysostom, St. Augustine, St. Athanasius, St. Hilary Poitiers. I think that's very important too.
So he says, so I should avoid the OCA. Well, I mean, one of their bishops is the guy who teaches transgender souls, and he also denies the reality of the toll houses. So probably, I mean, I personally, I mean,
yes,
I would try.
You can stop it there. How about that?
If you want to find a true, look for true Orthodox churches. You can find them on the internet. It depends on what state you're in, but you'd be surprised. There's 100 true Orthodox parishes in the U.S. alone.
We got about 15 minutes left, Father, at this point.
I don't understand this. Can you please, Atomic Lead, can you please elaborate on the concept of preheat? There's that famous article against the R.C. Francis of Assisi about the term, and a month ago there was
Prelist.
Oh, prelist.
I think he mistyped.
Prelist is delusion. Roughly, it's plani in Greek, and it roughly translates into self-delusion. We consider it to be, prelist is considered to be demonic in origin. Mm-hmm. And the point is, it is where you begin to deviate from the truth and begin to follow your own opinions or so on and so forth. Well, I'm Teresa of Avila. I mean, is she the one that had the marriage ceremony with Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these kind of RC nuns did. I mean, there's the one who was the one that in the France that said that Christ took his own heart out and put it in her heart and exchanged them.
Isn't that Margaret Mary Alacoque?
Yeah, and then and La Cambra had to publish her visions, and she said she had a vision that said she had to be bled every day because she was producing so much of the holy blood or something. I mean, it was just kind of, and then when they published that in France, it was this big scandal, and no one really reads the full revelations anymore because they were so crazy.
Yeah.
So must have needed to preheat the oven.
Yeah.
So.
Well, okay, I should have probably guessed it was prelist. In any case, all right. So we've got about 13 minutes left. Let's see here. We're still waiting for Roman Catholic apologists, Papal apologists. If you're listening to this, we've got a few people listening, and if any of you is a Roman Catholic apologist and you have access to the War Room or War Zone, you can pop on live and talk with us directly.
Well, any regular person, if they want to come on, they can come on.
Yeah, if you just want to come on and say, "Hey, Father, how are you doing?" That's fine too. But in any case, the point is that So that's
Well, let's since we've talked about this issue a little bit before, but how do we respond as Orthodox Father? I know how we respond, but I want to hear you say it to people who say that clerical celibacy is it's the abuses people are complaining about. The idea of having all priests be celibate won't necessarily lead to abuse. It's only if you have the gay people ordained. You need to have manly priests ordained or whatever.
Well, the problem is that a manly priest will fall into sins as well. And here's what I'm going to explain, because I've explained this before. In Orthodoxy, there is a distinction between the white and the black clergy. And what we mean by that is the lay clergy and the monastic clergy. Monastics live in a monastery. They live with co-strugglers. Some a few, some have many. But the point is, they are struggling away from the world. Lay people are in the world. And because they're in the world, having a spouse is a special grace, a special weapon that protects you from the temptations you will see in the world. Because monasteries have totally different types of temptations. And Father Enoch will attest to that. It's not the same, but there are temptations. But the point is, when you're in the world, you're confessing and dealing with single people, single women. And you're a young unmarried priest who isn't a sodomite. Well, most likely you're going to fall into another kind of sin. And unfortunately, that's the reality. Like,
for example, in Rome in the 1960s, I mean, I know this because I knew people, who told me stories about, I know people who were Roman Catholic clergy back in the 60s, all right? And there were these stories about how priests would go over to Rome, and if they forgot to wear, they forgot to wear this, special hat, like a brimmed hat, a black brim. Yeah, if they didn't wear that, then it meant they were trying to attract prostitutes. And there were all these famous brothels in Rome that were catered only to priests and such.
Wow.
And the excuse was that, well, at least they're not the gays. At least it keeps the gays away.
Well,
I
yeah.
mean,
Well, the gays aren't going to the prostitutes anyway.
exactly. I mean,
They're going
so
to each other.
yeah, but yeah. My point was, if it got to a point in the papal system where, they were saying, well, at least they're going to prostitutes and not going to other men, going to men or something like that. I mean, you got a really messed up system if that is the measure of success.
Okay, we're getting much more. We're getting more
Okay, so
questions.
what is your opinion on the church calendar, new old? This will help me to narrow down my search for the church. The traditional church calendar, the old calendar, is the correct one. It's been affirmed by numerous church councils. The introduction of the new calendar, or
Is what helped create the schism to begin.
yeah, it's one of the things that it precipitated upon ecumenism. You can read the 1920 encyclical that said it was done for ecumenical reasons. It led to nothing but continual woe and destruction in orthodoxy,
which we're still seeing today.
We're still seeing today. And you can say, well, in the abstract, it's not necessarily bad. Well, it wasn't introduced in the abstract.
Yeah,
right?
in the abstract doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right.
No, but those are the same weirdos in Protestant that created the false devotions that Antiochians follow in their false Western rite. Mm-hmm. All I can do is pray for them that they abandon those. Some of them seem to be doubling down on them. I hope that they stop. We talked about this. I think it was either the last episode or the one before that it's attracting a market.
Yeah. Vinnie King says, what do you make of Pope Leo or St. Leo's asserting authority at Chalcedon? Do you think Pope St. Leo viewed Rome as having Vatican I-like authority?
Well, I mean, I'm still waiting I love when I hear, and I'm not saying you, Vinny, because I don't know if you're a Roman Catholic or not, but the point is, I love when I hear Roman Catholics say Pope St. Leo asserted authority at Chalcedon. It gives me this picture of St. Leo just coming up to the podium with all these bishops surrounding and being like, respect my authority. Nothing of the sort ever happened. In the first place, there were legates there. In the second place, his tome was reviewed by all the bishops before they said Peter had spoken through Leo. In the third case, he wasn't there with the 28th Council, the 28th Canon. He rejected it later because of Antioch and Alexandria's privileges being superseded by Constantinople.
Yeah, he said it contradicted Nicaea. That was his reason for rejecting it.
So none of it's real. And so let's see here.
Okay. That's the old calendar question. We just answered that. It's the correct calendar.
Who repent can be the holiest of saints, just like St. Mary. Technically, St. Mary of Egypt was not a prostitute. She was a loose woman. Not saying that that's better. In some ways, it's worse. But the point is, she wouldn't have disagreed with either assertion. But the point is, I just want to get the technical thing right. She was not technically a prostitute. There have been prostitutes who repented, but she was kind of just worse. But she got better and became a great saint.
St. Mary of Egypt, we're talking about, right?
Right.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think we're about 7 minutes in, and we're 7 minutes to the ending.
And so, once again, last chance for any Roman Catholics on this third day of calling out all the papal apologists who still haven't answered us yet.
Maybe they just don't think we're professional enough, Father Joseph.
Really? I mean, how professional do you?
They can't waste their time on the likes of us.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what they're thinking.
Well, I'm sure a lot of them are. I mean, they're very professional people. We don't have master's degrees or doctorates.
The number one reason I've gotten in trying to call out people on that Protestant list, the number one reason is they just keep saying, "But we're one church. We don't want to fight you." But I'm like, "But you're not," and they kind of ignore it. So
okay, Atomic Lead, what do you got?
He said he had an RC related question a little bit above. Hold on. Is that? It can't be real. I'm not gonna. I don't want to read that. Yeah, I'm not reading that. They're probably assault rifle. They're probably scared off by your talks on Hildebrand. Well, then read more about Hildebrand. If you want to debate us on the matter, shoot, they've controlled the discussion.
Well, remember, technically, and this is interesting, Hildebrand was not even beatified in the Roman Catholic Church until what, like 1632?
Yeah, it was like 600 years after his death.
He wasn't even canonized until like 1720 because there was so many people did not like him.
Well,
because remember, technically, even though the Hildebrandians won, they won ultimately because the emperor kind of eventually, there was something like the Synod of Worms or whatever, like 1111 or whatever. And what happened is that was ultimately wrong for them to capitulate, and that ultimately, I think, was one of the major problems that led to the permanent death of Orthodoxy and as a mass group in the West coming back, because basically they capitulated, but they went underground, those who survived, and they came out as basically the Gallicans, the Latin conciliarists. So they kind of submitted to papal authority, the ones who weren't killed off, to survive, and it wasn't right, but they kind of repackaged themselves in a kind of what we call the conciliar tradition, the Latin conciliarism, or Gallicanism. Later came to be called Febronianism in the Holy Roman Empire and such. And ultimately they still weren't listened to. And what did that lead to? It led to the Reformation, and which led to the Enlightenment, which led to everything as we now see it happening. Okay.
Let me see here. What else did we have here?
Someone says, just ask even the most traditionalist Roman Catholic if he believes that the Pope is undoubtedly made a saint through the merits of St. Peter. That's one of the Dictatus Papae decrees.
Right, it is, and it's one of the ones that eventually they started backing off of. I mean, the Dictatus Papae formed the basis of later Roman canon law, but it is insane. And quite frankly, even Roman Catholics eventually realized you can't follow everything in the Dictatus Papae. It's literally an insane document. But keep in mind, a literally insane document formed the basis for what became the Roman Catholic Church.
And I think it should be pointed out that forgeries and fraudulent forgeries, documents, can in fact have profound impact for decades and centuries on the church. For example, it was a pseudo letter of St. Athanasius that was several false letters of 4th century fathers like St. Athanasius and Pope St. Julian and others that were written by Apollinarians, all right, to justify their beliefs, that were later taken up by the Monophysites in the 430s and 40s after St. Cyril died, all right? And St. Cyril even eventually that was the whole issue about the one nature of the Word of God incarnate. That was actually from an Apollinarian forgery. Now, St. Cyril interpreted it in an Orthodox manner, but what's true is that by the time you get to John of Antioch and the reconciliation, I think some scholars say he began to be suspicious of these things and to back away from them, all right? But the Monophysites basically made use of these pseudo-patristic letters, and it led to eventually, the Monophysite heresy and schism. All right. So things like false letters and forgeries based upon the Isidorian Decretos and all the rest can have profound impact. In the case of the Isidorian Decretos, what happened is they ran up against the massive ecclesiastical inertia of the Latin metropolitanical system in the West, which which was not able to be broken down into Hildebrand. And even he couldn't completely break it down. He just had to make everybody technically submit to his theoretical power, or his successors were able to do that. After he has supported numerous revolts of the so-called anti-king Rudolph and all these other ones that basically created mass destruction throughout Germany and basically terrorized everybody. And then you have the Patarini, who were his allies, that were originally Gnostic Manichaeans that were quote-unquote rehabilitated into the Hildebrandian group, and they basically went around killing married priests and murdering people and they drove out almost all the priests out of Milan and terrorized the Lombard countryside. So,
all right. Well, we've hit the
what false documents of St. Christopher you're referring to? No. I'm referring to is someone talking about this? Hold on.
Yeah, it's atomically. It was somebody had mentioned the effects of pseudo-Chrysostom upon Aquinas. Aquinas used a lot of incorrect documents, forged documents.
Yeah, I don't think Aquinas is still a heresiarch, but my point is I don't think he actually knew these were false. I think they were actually accepted by almost everybody at the time. Now, he may have been much worse than I thought. Maybe he did, but I don't think he did. I think people just assumed that all these, for example, again, we went through it last program. If you look at Aquinas' work against the Orthodox, like almost all the quotes, or 95% of them, are basically pseudo and forged. You got St. Athanasius teaching the Filioque in some of them and such,
Yeah, it's basically Thomas Aquinas quotes it in the Catena Aurea. That's part of the reason why. Another reason why I don't trust the Catena Aurea. So, in that case, I would agree there. Okay, so I think we've answered all the questions for today. I mean, I think we're gonna do. We'll do another.
Yeah, I think he assumed that. I think he probably assumed. See, the problem is that you got to remember the 13th century. Most people still assumed the pseudo Isidore in the West were still believing the pseudo Isidorian decretals were actually true and accurate. So, if people are accepting those documents, then that's going to be they're going to accept anything else too. So, I mean, you can just fabricate documents. For example, there's a fabricated letter of Saint Isidore talking about how you should only use unleavened bread.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And that was used as a big thing for a long time. People were like, well, St. Isidore, that's the 600s. If he said it, then it must be true. Well, it's a fabricated letter from, like, I don't know, like the 12th century or something like that. So, anyway, we're ending Father Joseph, and I guess you're going to head over and migrate over.
I'm going to migrate over to the Carm channel and see what they are saying about the Orthodox and all that fun stuff, and I guess following along and moving over there. So, in any case, I can put a link in the chat. Let me see here. Hold on. Wonder if there. Yeah, let's see. Click here. I guess this is the link. Hold on.
While you're doing that, in between names, ask, can you address the Latin West's acceptance of the first 50 apostolic canons, even after the schism in the Vatican I? Yeah, I think in the West, they didn't really have copies of the apostolic canons until they were translated by Dionysius Exiguus, if I pronounce his name correctly.
Yeah, Exiguus.
And he did translate the other 85, but I'm not sure. He translated the one edition that was 50, and then later he translated the other 35. But the edition with the 50 were more widely accepted than the other 85. And so, I mean, it was done before the schism, as was after it. And now, technically, you can argue that when various of the 8th century popes accepted most of Trullo, they did ratify the first two canons, Canon 1 or 2, which actually talks about all the apostolic canons. Did Ivo Chartres have them accepted? I don't know. Ivo Chartres is, like, I think, around the year 1100. I'm not too familiar if he did. I'd have to look that up in between names. So I can get back to you next time we talk.
Yeah, one thing to remember is that a lot of the canonical collections in the West were not arranged by the 11th century, and especially after the 11th century, in any way recognizable to us in terms of their individual councils.
Yeah. For example, I have a book. You would find collections of canons that would basically be like 200 canons in a book from all kinds of councils, and maybe there would be a heading from Ankara, maybe there'd be a heading from Angers, from Agde, or something like that.
Right.
But you didn't have it. It wasn't like how we have the medallion today. Oh, you're going to turn to different councils, and it's going to have the canons, and then it's going to have the little canon.
I think that it would have been that way. I think it would have been. It was that way in Eastern collections. But
that's because I think they had more immediate access to things. Anyway.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank everyone for listening. Father, if you want to stay and answer more questions, I'm cool with that. I want to go over there and see what happens.
No, I'm not too good on my own, so.
I think you give.
I'm your acolyte. I can't really do this on my own self.
I'm not even gonna. People, I don't. Who says that?
We know who says that.
Well, I'm trying to. I mean, outside of
the crazy.
Couple of crazies that we deal with. That's not really.
Well, okay. If you want me to stay, I'll stay, Master. So.
Wow.
No. I gotta go.
You gotta put me on the spot like that.
I know. I gotta go actually. So.
All right, sounds good. Well, we're gonna go. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back next week. Same time, same channel, and hey, have a good night.
All right. Benedicite.